For her latest book, There Were Soldiers, she was embedded with the American forces in Afghanistan to report on the war's impact on soldiers and then follow them home. Our second panelist is David Finkel. He's a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist as well as an editor and writer for the Washington Post. He also won the Robert F. Kennedy Award for Excellence in Journalism for his reporting on illegal immigration. David is also a recipient of the MacArthur Genius Award for his narrative journalism, particularly in his coverage of the war in Iraq. He spent a year embedded with the U.S. soldiers in Baghdad for his book, The Good Soldiers. His new book, Thank You for Your Service, is a follow-up to that book and focuses on the lives of soldiers when they return home. Thank You for Your Service is a finalist for the 2013 National Book Critics Circle Award. Thanks for being here, guys. And I think we should start by just each of you give a little brief overview of your books. And we'll start with Anne.
Okay. Let me say first, it's a big honor to be on this panel. I'm a great admirer of David's book, and I'm also just happy to be here because I take the presence of all these people in the audience as a real tribute to books and writers. And in this kind of solitary profession, we don't often get that, so thank you all for being here. My book, They Were Soldiers, follows some, not soldiers home from the war, but follows the wounds of soldiers. My book I tend to see the soldiers not so much as individuals whose whole stories I need to tell, but rather as I give little snapshots, because I see them as interchangeable parts in the great American war-making machine, which is how the Pentagon kind of regards them as well, despite public statements to the contrary. I want to tell you a little bit about how I came to write this book. I went to Afghanistan in 2002 as a humanitarian aid worker. I was a New Yorker. I didn't approve of our policy after the attack on New York. I thought it was immoral and illegal and frightening and all of those things. So I walked my talk and went to Afghanistan to help or try to be of assistance to women who had been victims of Soviet and Afghan and American violence there. I should say that prior to this time, my earlier career as a writer has been as a feminist writer of books about women and chiefly about violence against women. And then in 2006, I wrote a book about my experiences with women and others as a humanitarian aid worker there called Kabul in Winter. That's an old book now. It came out in 2006, but if I say so myself, it's still a pretty damn good guide to why things have gone belly up in Afghanistan. In 2010, the military got the bright idea of putting women soldiers outside the wire to make friends with Afghan women and gather intelligence that would help us win the war once and for all. And I thought that was another in the long line of misguided military strategies. And I got, for the first time then, I embedded with American soldiers in order to cover and participate in the training of the first of those teams of women. They were called Female Engagement Teams, or FETs, and as I suspected, they did turn out to be a really misguided idea. But what happened when I went to forward bases to cover the training of those women was I found myself on bases that might have a handful of women, half a dozen, maybe a dozen women soldiers, in the midst of hundreds of men. And apart from my observations of American soldiers in Kabul, where they were extremely aggressive and in your face and made everybody really angry, made enemies everywhere they went, this was my first time spent among American soldiers. And I saw some of them melting down, which started to change the way I looked at them. And then we happened to be, most of that time, on the border with Pakistan, which was very hot at the time. And so every day, soldiers were being wounded and killed. And what happens when a squad goes outside the wire and someone is cut down, they're picked up by a medevac helicopter, and the members of their own squad return to base in their armored vehicles and park and sit there for a long time, trying to come to terms with the buddy or buddies who have disappeared from their squad on that day. And it may be weeks or days or even weeks before the squad finds out what happens to the wounded they left behind or sent off in a helicopter. So I wanted to know what happened to those wounded. And so it took me a year then to get permission from the military to embed in the medevac experience. So my book is about following wounded soldiers from the time they're wounded in the field, taken to Bagram, the central base, and then to flown with full medical attention to Landstuhl Military Hospital in Germany, which is America's largest hospital outside the United States, where the operations and the treatment continues, and then they're flown on again to Dover Air Base in Delaware and taken from there by ambulance to Walter Reed and Bethesda. And then from there, I went on to the homes of soldiers who were suffering psychological and physical wounds, and looked at the impacts on the family and on the communities of which those soldiers had been members, and also visited families who had lost their sons and daughters to suicide after they had returned from combat. So that's mainly what this book is about. But I should stress too that there is a lot about the medics and the medical personnel who treat these soldiers all the way home, because one of the great surprises and revelations to me in following this story was to see the impact upon the medical personnel who have to treat the soldiers. And it is extreme, because they've never seen such catastrophic injuries to the human body before.
Yes, I think the Tucson wasn't a doctor who worked on Gabby Giffords, which came out of Iraq or Afghanistan.
Yeah.
David, why don't you talk to us about your book, which has obviously similar themes?
Yes, some similarities, maybe a slightly different approach. First, thanks for coming. I appreciate this very much. I've been at this particular story since early 2007, when the Iraq War, seems like a long time ago now. But at that point, there had been several versions of the Iraq War, and the consensus seemed to be that it had reached its last chance moment, perhaps its lost moment, or to a writer's way of thinking, its tragic moment. And in January of 2007, when George W. Bush announced, instead of withdrawing, receding, he was going to try this thing called the surge, and more troops were headed into this war, that interested me as a writer and as a journalist. Pardon me. And so I wanted to write about that. First, I did an article for the Washington Post where I work, and that turned into a book called The Good Soldiers. And basically what happened is I got in touch with a battalion commander, a guy named Ralph Koslerich, lieutenant colonel out of Fort Riley, because his guys were going into this thing. And I said, I want to go along. I want to write a book, not a policy book. not a book with any kind of agenda. I'm not out to say the war is good or the war is bad or the surge was a